Hi, I'm just going to answer that chat question. It's no one is speaking because we're waiting for everyone to arrive in the Zoom room. And when that happens, Rob's going to tell me, and then I'll introduce Crystal and we'll start.
I think we can probably get going, Jackie.
Okay, right, I will start then. So I'm Jackie Hall and I'm Vice Chair of the Society for Church Archaeology for just another week or two. And it's my pleasure today to both attend this lecture and introduce Crystal, who surprisingly I've only met for the first time today, even though she works at Southwark and so do I. So she's she's working on a PhD at Exeter on historic graffiti, which is a very popular subject. And so I'm really pleased that she's going to share some of her information with me, and it might even include parts of Suffolk and Southwark, which are close to my heart. And so we'll go straight ahead to her talk so we don't miss anything. And it's Reading the Room, What Historic Graffiti Tells Us. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie, for that lovely introduction. Let me share my screen, make sure that that works. All right, hopefully everybody can see my screen. If not, yeah, thank you, Rob. All right, hello everybody, and thank you for coming this evening to this talk. Kind of order of operations, so I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, who I am, what I do. Then we're going to talk about what graffiti is, so we have a clear definition of what we are actually working with when we're talking about graffiti and we're talking about looking for it and interpreting it. Then I'm going to give you kind of an overview of the different types of graffiti you may come across. Now, by no means is this exhaustive. In my personal little typology, I have about 30 odd types of graffiti. We're only going to touch on some of the ones you're most likely going to find in churches near you. And then we're going to look at a couple of case studies, so then we can have an idea of what do we do with graffiti after we have it? What does it mean after we've spotted it? And then very briefly, we'll touch on conservation. So let's get into it. So as Jackie said, I am Crystal Hollis, doing my PhD at University of Exeter. My thesis area is largely on Suffolk churches, but I've done work on churches kind of all over the country. London, Hereford, Wiltshire, Norfolk, Suffolk, everywhere. So what is graffiti? So typically when I'm working with graffiti, I like to think of it as closely as possible to Bob Meeson's definition, which is something that's not part of a formal design scheme. So it's something that is not planned. It's not considered to be part of the original paint scheme, woodworking, statues, anything like that. It's something that's added after the fact, and it's something that's done rather informally. Now, this does get a bit tricky when we start looking later on at things that are architectural designs and mason's marks. Sometimes those are meant to be seen, sometimes they're not. But generally speaking, we don't consider those objects to be something that is meant to be put on display or meant to have a big feature visually in a church. So that is what we're talking about with graffiti. So jumping right into the different kinds that you can see. Most commonly when we think of graffiti today, we think of bright bits of paint on walls, on train cars, that sort of thing. Most graffiti that you're going to find in historic churches from the medieval and early modern periods is going to be in stone. It's going to be etched. Sometimes you'll get stuff etched into paint or plaster instead, or in wood, but largely where we find most of the stuff in our corpus is in stone. So the number one thing we think of is writing, of course. This is a very famous inscription. It's from St. Mary the Virgin in Ashwell, Hertfordshire. It is, the one bit is about the plague and how many people have died. And then the other bit is about a storm that rolled through and damaged the church. We know that this is quite old based on the letter forms. If I have any paleographers in the audience, you can probably give me a very exact date for this without even having to read it. So writing gives us an idea. This is something that's for the community. It's something for other people to read. It's part of the history that's recorded on the building itself. We see a similar pattern of behavior in Italy when we're looking at Veronique Plescher's work. She talks a lot about little chapels with entire parish histories written into wall paintings next to images of saints. This is kind of a similar thing. This is the community reflecting back on itself. And so that would be this purpose of this kind of writing. Other kinds of writing, we get our names. This is a piece from St. Bartholomew the Great in Smithfield. It's up in the Triforium, so it's not publicly accessible. But it's a very large John of London or Johann London. It's just a name, but we can tell based on the letters. They're very big letters, they're very swoopy. It's very skilled hand magic to do this. I tend to use writing like this as an indicator of certain levels of education or an indicator of certain levels of literacy. So we have that aspect of writing as well, people just kind of tying themselves to the building in one way. In some churches in Suffolk, I have names from the Lords of the Manor written on the church fabric, kind of linking themselves with the space, linking themselves with the holiness of the space that is kind of contained within those four walls. And it's a very direct link, and that's kind of what people are doing there. And then finally, we have something that's more personal. Personal history stuff is my favorite. It's not wildly common. The most popular personal history stuff that I get anyway is usually stuff of somebody being made a bell ringer. This one's from Winchester Cathedral. It says, Harry Copper was sworn bell ringer in the year of our Lord 1545. My favorite thing about this is when you look lower down, you can see Harry was started, and then clearly there was a decision to write this a little bit bigger and a little bit higher up on the stone for people to see. But you do get this kind of behavior of like, I did this, or so-and-so did this, something of the physical self or the personal self being represented in this space. And again, tying an individual to it. So that's the kind of thing you can expect to see with writing. You're either going to see a community history, you're going to see somebody kind of claiming or linking themselves to it, or you're going to see an aspect of somebody's personal history reflected in these different kinds of writings in different areas of the church. I'm not going to talk too much about this. These are apotropaic marks or protective. There's so much out there on the subject that I could spend hours talking about it and still only barely scratch the surface, no pun intended, but also there's just plenty of other stuff that's been said. Lots of other presentations, lots of really good things, books. There's a really good book by Brian Hoggard. There's some work done by Alison Fern on apotropaic marks in and out of secular spaces. I just don't have that much more to add. So we're going to briefly go over what they are. We see a couple of circle designs and something that looks like a stick. So let's start with our circle designs and break them down a bit. The small one down at the bottom with the 6 petals, that's the very famous hex foil or daisy wheels, it is called sometimes. This is usually considered to be protective because it's an unending line. And the thought is that something evil, whether it be a spirit or a devil, will find this line and follow it, trying to find a way out and just get confused and get kind of trapped or stuck. That's one way that these are interpreted. If you look directly above it, however, this is the more interesting one for me. It's this, I'll use my cursor. It's this big circle here. And you see it's got 4 petals and they're slightly shaded in. When we take a look at this particular church, which is St. Margaret of Antioch, Coolidge, and we look towards the front at the chancel arch, there are 2 brilliantly painted consecration crosses right there on the chancel arch. So this is almost mimicking what is up at the front in a way. So this isn't a formal consecration cross, but it seems to be somebody mimicking one and therefore mimicking that kind of level of power of holiness by making this particular kind of graffiti. And next to it is the thing that looks like a stick. This is a ragged staff. Colin Turrod's done some really good work on these, and he also does a lot of stuff with pilgrim badges. So if you're interested in this design, please take a look at his work. It's a design that's usually considered to be connected to St. Christopher or the Virgin Mary. Sometimes it's associated with the Earls of Warwick, but in this context, I really don't think that's very likely. In this particular church, this motif shows up several times. And so it's clear that it likely has something to do with a representation of the saint. From this vantage point in the church, if you were making it, you could clearly see the Virgin Mary in a wall painting. So there may be a connection here. The trouble with things that are labeled apotropaic is that some of these designs are very simple to make at other points in time or for other reasons. Sometimes circles are used to measure out architectural designs to see where things are going to go. Sometimes the pilgrim badge stick is mimicking something and people don't necessarily have that deeper understanding of the possible connection to it. And then sometimes you will find some of these were made quite recently and are just doodles. I had somebody come up to me once after a talk and say, oh, you mentioned this building. If you look in this back corner, we made those about 20 years ago during a barn dance because we were very, very drunk and we're bored. So circles are very tricky. And when it comes to interpreting them, I like to rely on the space itself. So these I would tend to say are probably protective because we have this mixture of all these different things that could potentially be protective by design. And also from a functional standpoint, these are all right near the doorway into the church, right across from where the porch enters. So you have that kind of space where people are coming and going. You want to kind of leave something negative behind you or ensure that it can't follow you into the space. And then we have this clustering. You can actually see the start of another daisy wheel down at the very, very bottom there. We have this nice clustering. So this seems to be the space to be making these designs. Moving swiftly on, buildings. Within a building, we get other representations of buildings. This is again from the stunning Church of St. Mary in Ashwell. And of course, this is the church that has the famous inscription of St. Paul's Cathedral before the London fire. This is another building that's somewhere, it's in the very back, the western end of the nave. There's not a lot of good clues as to what it is though. There's thoughts that it might be a representation of the church, not an actual identical drawing, but a representation of that church itself. There's thoughts that it may be a neighboring parish's church or a church that no longer exists. Someone has mentioned that they think it could possibly be representing a shrine. We don't have a concrete connection to any other physical building that's left at this point to match this up to. It'd be interesting to do some really cool documentary research on this in the future. Hint, hint for anybody who would like a side project. But we do get these really interesting representations of what people are seeing in their everyday life, or what they are passing, and how they bring it into the church space. Another really good example of this is with windmills. Now in Suffolk, in my region of Suffolk, which is near the Cambridge border, there are several churches that have these depictions of windmills in them. This one is from St. Mary the Virgin in Lydgate. You can see it's got initials in it. So we'll talk about memorials in a minute. It's coming up. But usually when we see initials in something, we think maybe it's a memorial. Kind of hard to tell in this context, but we have these large windmills in this church. There's about a dozen of them scattered throughout the building. And again, there's roads in this area of Suffolk that are called things like Windmill Lane. So people are going to church, passing these mills. We have documentation of mills being in this area for hundreds of years. This is just what they're seeing, and they're bringing it into the church. Now, the other flip side of this is we have all these mills in this church. Were these people actually millers? Was this part of the family? Was this people, their occupation? And then now putting it on the walls to represent themselves within the space by kind of showing like, this is my job, or this is part of my family. It could be one of or two of those things, but the sheer quantity of windmills that I get in this particular region tends to have me thinking that people are going out and seeing these things and then bringing their world and their perspectives into the church space to kind of tailor it to their own experience. Along with buildings, we sometimes get drawings of people. This is a very famous, another famous inscription from Leighton Buzzard. It is allegedly the depiction of the creation of the first Simnel cake. So this is supposed to be Simon and Nellie. However, those of you who do a lot of work with medieval manuscripts and misericords will recognize a similar scene of just a very shrewish woman scolding her husband. We can see that she's got him by the ear. She's got his spoon, presumably to strike him about the head for whatever he's done wrong this time. And this is used as kind of one of those little morality things, these little life lessons that appear in church artwork that seem like they're very mundane, but actually mean something to the community. Now, where this particular inscription is a bit weird. It's tucked around up near it's not quite the chancel screen, but it's back towards facing one of the chapels. And its height, you would basically need to be sitting in like a chair or on a stool in order to create this comfortably. This would have taken several hours to do. Seeing inscriptions like this definitely kind of explains like, this wasn't something that people looked down on. It wasn't something that people kind of walked away from. This was something that was probably socially acceptable because the sheer amount of time it would have taken to make this. If you look carefully, you can see that the stone is actually rounded and shaped really beautifully in some places. There's folds to her skirt. The like spoon is actually scooped out. He has some dimension to his hat. This isn't something that somebody, put together in 20 minutes time and walked away. This took hours to do. So it's very likely this would have been seen while people were processing through the church on certain days. Given the interesting history of that church, there was probably a private chapel nearby as well that this would have been overlooking. There's one other type of inscription similar to this in the building with this level of detail, and it is just a man's head, and it's not too far off from where this one is. Along with humans, we get animals. Animals can be really, really tricky. This one's for you, Jackie. These are from Southwark Cathedral in the Harvard Chapel. They're very clearly monsters. We can't really tell what they are. The one here with the shorter ear and the rounded nose, to me, looks more like a lion or a big cat, something you would see in medieval marginalia, something along those lines. But the other thing, when we do our workshops at Southwark Cathedral, we spend a bit of time talking about all the different possibilities this animal could be. And I've heard everything from people think it's a dog to a duck, to other various mythical beasts. We can't just always be sure. But with animals, sometimes you will get fish, you'll get something that's a swan or a hare, or something that's much more clear. If you go to St. Albans, they have several very clearly done animals, including a cat. And this is, again, people bringing the daily life and the mundane into the spiritual place, and it's represented as part of their kind of everyday view shed, their kind of everyday life, their practice is put into this special place. There's also another possible reason, though, and that could be trade. If there's a lot of deer, where there are a lot of hunts near here, if there's a hare, could that be tied to somebody's surname? There's a lot of different reasons why we could have animals, and birds in particular are ones that are difficult to interpret, because you can have an eagle and a hawk and a falcon all drawn just in simple line work on stone next to each other, and they look very, very similar without some sort of color scheme to differentiate them. You can't really tell which one it is. And in the medieval and early modern world, birds had very distinct meanings from each other and very different levels of importance and different messages. So sometimes you'll see something and go, oh, that looks like an eagle. And then somebody else will say, oh, it looks like a falcon. You kind of just have to write it off as bird of prey because you don't want to start attaching a lot of meanings to something without more hard evidence. This is another one from the Harvard Chapel. He's about this big, he's tiny. A lot of people think he's a griffin. I certainly think he's along the more fantastical line. He has these little ears at the back of his head and almost like a little dog nose. I would suggest that the stuff in the Harvard Chapel is people copying things that they see in manuscripts and putting them on walls. And that's probably all there is to the ones that are located there. This is a rarer type of inscription that I know I said I was going to give you guys stuff that you could find easily, but this one's just so cool that I really wanted to show it off. It's a rebus puzzle, and it's again from St. Mary the Virgin in Lydgate. Violet Pritchard talks about this in her book. If you look, you can see we have well written out here, and then we have a little piece of music. That music is fa, re, mi, la. Then we have the letters D, Y, and we have this little square with some dots in it, and then Y, N, E. At first glance, if this was me, I wouldn't know what to do with this. I'd be very confused. Letters and music and square, like what's going on here? But Violet Pritchard took this inscription to a couple of different professors. She actually details it in her book. And they were able to figure out this is a rebus. So it's something that's using pictures to kind of phonetically sound out words. When you put it all together, it's actually welfare, milady, Catherine, or Catherine. And this puzzle shows up about 3 times in the church, either in whole like this, or just welfare, milady, depending on where you are in the building. So it's kind of interesting that it repeats itself multiple times in this space. Someone must have been very sad about this woman to take the time to carve this. If you do see anything that's weird like this, where it's a mixture, please send it to somebody, because it's probably a rebus, it's probably a puzzle, it might be something really cool. And we would love to have a look at it and try and figure it out. So I warned you that memorials were going to make an appearance. And so here they are. These are some lovely ones from Norwich Cathedral. Obviously, death dates of 1634. We have a lot of initials, it's pretty similar initials until we get to the JA in the middle. Work was done by the team in Norfolk on this one, and they deduced that this is like a plague year and a lot of people died. And therefore, these little houses with the initials and the dates and the fleur-de-lis or the cross or the flag or whatever is on top, because it seems to change from building to building. It's probably a little mini memorial, just like you get the big stone memorials on the walls of churches and cathedrals. These are little mini ones for people who didn't have money in order to commission that kind of thing. Matt Champion's done some work on that. And so when you look at these and you have all these little houses in a row, it becomes kind of this interesting little memorial space, this almost internal like churchyard in a way, where people can come and remember their loved ones. However, sometimes you get them in wood and not on stone. This is where I said you get stuff sometimes on wood. This is a really cool one. It's really interesting because it's the only one of its kind in this church. I looked really, really hard for other little graffiti at all in this church. And in the main body, this is it. This is from St. Clement's Eastcheap in London. It's now in what is a toilet, but it would be in what was the nave at that time. So someone made this. It's one of the more beautiful ones. It's really interesting because it's made up almost entirely of compass drawn designs and circles, and it's quite interesting. And if you pay attention to the date, this is 1703. The other one was 1643. This kind of motif seems to exist in church graffiti for at least about 200 years. I have examples that are from the early 1600s, and it seems to fizzle out the very end of the 1700s for some odd reason. There doesn't seem to be like a clear cutoff date, but it seems to kind of die off around the 1780s, 1790s. I so far have not seen one with an 1800s date, but if anybody has one, please let me know. And like, again, kind of showing, we have these ones from 1725 here. We have multiple initials showing up in these boxes. This is from St. Stephen Walbrook in London. And then down here, we start seeing things change over with a set of initials in just a square plain box. And it's like 1777-ish. And of course, by the time we hit the 1780s and 90s, this is again, St. Bartholomew the Great Smithfield. They just have a lot of good stuff in the Triforium that I like to show. You can see we have this really elaborate one in the center, and it's got dual roofs. You can see that the roofs are actually drawn in. There's been a considerable amount of effort put into this one. It's decorated with dots. It is 1780 something, looks like a 1. The initials, and then next to it, we have another one that has a filled in roof. The initials and the date are a bit too damaged to really read. And then there's 2 other ones on the other side of it that are quite small. And you have all these extra lines giving it dimension and really filling these things out. So we can see that this motif has gone from a very simple little square looking house with some initials and a date to something that's much more involved, something that's a little more filled in, detailed, and it kind of grows over time. And then it seems to just fizzle out at the end of the 18th century. But we need to address initials if we're going to address memorials. Oftentimes in churches, the #1 thing that you're going to find is these little groupings of initials. This is again, St. Mary's in Ashwell. It's just such a good example of palimpsested initials all overlapping each other. There's so much going on here. We could literally sit here for the next about half an hour picking out individual sets of initials. We have the name Worley up in the corner. We have little bits of just initials in little tiny boxes, little cartouches scattered throughout. We have loose initials just on their own, standing out there in the wild, doing their own thing. There's a lot going on here. This is clearly a space in the church where people are commemorating things or memorializing things. Now with initials, especially when there's a lack of a date, it's almost impossible to guarantee what they are for, because we can't run it against burial records. We can't run it against baptisms or anything else. But we do have to consider in the medieval and early modern period, there is this thing called like the wheel of life or the life cycle. And it was very, very important to communities that like you hit certain hallmarks. So you would be born and then you would be able to walk. At some point, you would be able to go to the fields and work. You would be able to take on an apprenticeship. You would get married, you would have kids, all these different things all through your life until you hit the end of the circle. And then that is, of course, inevitably death. So I would posit, based on some of the things that I've seen in churches, that a lot of times when we're getting initials like this, it's people just commemorating bits of their life, just things that are going on in their life. And we're going to talk about that in a case study in just a little bit. But when we see these names, when we see these initials, that's what they're doing. They're just marking down something happened, something, to them that is interesting enough to document for the community, and they put it with other people's initials who've done something similar. This is from a gallery space in Southwark Cathedral. There's a lot of little initials and names up there. It probably was popular once you hit a certain point in life to go add your initials to the wall. But then initials also seem to take a turn. So this is where the phrase graffiti attracts graffiti kind of comes into play. If we look carefully at these images of this effigy, we can see a very faint little house here, which usually memorial again. So somebody linking their dead loved one to this particular bishop at Exeter Cathedral. And then as we start to look out, we see a lot of other initials, some full-on written names, and the styles seem to change. We get this really like much newer bit of writing down here. It looks like it's something out of like the late 1800s, early 1900s. So graffiti starting to change physically, but also in terms of meaning. By this point in time, we've had several iconoclastic movements. We've had the Puritans, we've had all sorts of things happen. We've had various, Oxford movement, all sorts of things happening. The way people are using their churches isn't the same as when the churches were first built. The way people are interacting with these effigies is not the same as when the effigies were first installed. So graffiti, by proxy, will also be changing its purpose during this time. And when we kind of zoom out and we look, we can see that there's some stuff from the early 1600s, late 1600s, we have 1814 down there. And as we go through, we start to see initials just kind of cropping up everywhere and names. This is pretty much the point where people start going, oh, there's a bunch of initials here, I'll add mine too. And it goes from like either some sort of pilgrimage or some sort of remembrance to something that's kind of done more casually. It's possible, given that many of these effigies were around for the Civil War, some of this may have been done to deliberately deface or add to. But then we start getting these initials all through these different periods. You'll get on this particular monument, we have beautiful like monograms and gorgeous handwritten script that people have taken the time to carve into the alabaster. Beautiful, beautiful stuff. But what you also get is stuff like Bob Cooper from 2010, who decided to add his name to this monument. And now we also have graffiti on this monument from 2020 and 2022. I am now going to implore you, if you're ever in a church and see a lot of graffiti, to please not add to it. Just look at it, don't feel the need to contribute. But what it does show is that the behavior pattern continues. People go up, we see a bunch of writing, we see a bunch of initials, and we think, I'll just add my own. And that seems to be what happens in roughly the 1800s. Which leads me to pencil. Pencil becomes very popular, obviously, end of the 1800s, early 1900s. That's when we're really starting to get pencil. This is a fish from Southwark Cathedral. I am pleased to say it is my favorite fish. In all of the graffiti that I have found, this is my favorite fish right here. I love the big googly eye. So it's up in the tower space on a cabinet of all things. And on this cabinet, we have a lot of things going on. So Southwark Cathedral has a fairly complicated archaeology. It started out as a monastic institution and then turned into a parish church and had several things collapse and need to be rebuilt over time. The nave was completely and entirely reconstructed. It has a very multifaceted archaeological story behind it. And when you're up in this tower space, you get an idea of some of the people who were working up in that space and what they were doing. So we have this beautifully rendered pencil drawing of Christ on the cross. He has the crown of thorns. His arms are outstretched, and then we have this 33333 going across him. And you may be wondering what that's about. We are too. There's a number that's basically something dot 33333, and it goes all the way across the cabinet as if somebody was trying to make a very petty point about dividing something into thirds, just writing 3 over and over. You can also see overlapped on this image of Christ, we have people doing maths, people doing all sorts of numbers and figures. And then in other areas on this cabinet, we have what looks like measurements. We have some names and some dates from the 50s, from the 60s, one's from 1918. We have this nice, there's the fish again. We have this nice little square where people are clearly measuring out different things, presumably to cut things. At least when I did carpentry, that's what I measured out and shaded it to look like. So we have like these kind of concrete pieces of evidence of how people were working in this space, and it's all in pencil. Now, if you see pencil in the wild, as it were, absolutely do not touch it. Photograph it by all means, but it's super delicate, it's super sensitive. So humidity will make it fade, light will make it fade, and certainly touching it will smudge it and make it fade as well. So just do be a little bit careful with it if you see it. So as we segue from one type of pentland to another, this is again St. Bartholomew's the Great Smithfield with a tiny little architectural pencil drawing, because we're now going to talk about fun things like mason's marks and architectural drawings. This is super, super rare. It's a little cutaway of this church, which also has a very complicated archaeology. It started out also as a monastic institution, became a parish church. Parts of it were used as a factory or a school. Parts of it were completely pulled down. Very, very complicated. This is probably from the time they were doing restoration from where some of the factory had sat within the church body itself. And if you go today, you can still actually see some of the scarring in the church from where different bits were added on and taken away over time. It's fascinating stuff. But you can really see here that we've got the two triforium neatly drawn out, and then below it, the arches that stand over the aisle of the church that goes all the way around behind the altar and in front of the Lady Chapel. So, building churches, how is it done? What does graffiti tell us about that? These are assembly marks. They often get mistaken for VV marks because it's a V, and sometimes the lines next to them are very faint and hard to discern. But these are assembly marks. When you get two things where it matches up like this, you have a V and a V, and then this one's got 3 lines and this one's got 4. That's people cutting it out and laying it out before they install it, bringing it into the church and looking at the numbers to see what goes where. We have another great example of this here again in the roof space at Southwark Cathedral, where all these number 7s kind of come together and match up neatly. So this was done to prevent the wrong bits going in the wrong spaces, which would have impacted not only the look of the structure, but also the stability of the structure. When you see things like this, it's usually a timber mark of some description. It's there for assembly purposes, nothing to do with demons or protection whatsoever. In the same thread, we have mason's marks. Now, mason's marks are very complicated when you get into them properly. If you find yourself really interested in mason's marks, I would suggest you check out Dr. Jennifer Alexander's work at the University of Warwick. She's done some fantastic stuff on mason's marks and how they tell us about different building phases of a structure or about how masons actually conducted their work. Great stuff. If that's what you would like to research, that's where I would look. These are from St. Andrew Holborn in London in the tower space. And when you look at a mason's mark, the things that should be obvious is that they are clean and they are neat. When we look at these, yes, I know the lines don't join up on the one. That's because that's where the plaster fills it in and it physically can't join. Because of some restoration and work that was done. But generally speaking, they are neat, they are clean, they're fairly precise, and it's something that can be made relatively quickly. Now, there are exceptions to this rule. Sometimes we do get big, beautiful, fancy mason's marks in places like Lakecock Abbey. But generally speaking, a lot of times there'll be something that can be literally chiseled out in a few seconds. And this makes sure that a mason gets paid oftentimes per piece. And it makes sure that they're compensated properly. It's also a way for master masons to sign off on work in some instances. Sometimes when you get multiple mason's marks on the same bits of stone, that's what that can mean, someone's signing off on it. Or it's like the last bit of stone from that load. There's a bunch of different things it could be. Again, mason's marks are very complicated. But again, if you go and you see stuff like this and it looks kind of weird, but it looks very precise, the lines are usually very thin, they're usually very crisp. And they usually match up almost perfectly, if not perfectly, every time. Again, these were designed to be made with speed. Now, they can sometimes identify certain masons to us, but there's a little bit of a catch with that because there's only so many things that you can make that are of this kind of design without starting to overlap with other people. And also, different churches are built at different times or different work was done at different times. You can't necessarily assume it was the same person. It's just somebody took over that mark later on. And then this is just an example of some of the more elaborate mason's marks that you will get and things that I would urge caution with. So this one is an arrow. I've seen it used in several churches as a mason's mark alongside these big blocky A's, these letter A's. And then on the other hand there, we have a little cross with bars on the end. That doesn't look particularly too terribly neat. But given that there was one on this block and one nearby another block and one nearby another block, it's very likely that these were not there for religious purposes. These were not there for spiritual purposes. These are mason's marks. These are people marking out what they've done so that they could be compensated properly. So these are kind of more of the exception to the rule kind of mason's marks that we get. So finally, before we go into our case studies, I want to go into architectural designs that we find in graffiti. So oftentimes, so this is Leighton Buzzard again. It's got loads of architectural designs, lots of window tracery kind of all over the place. It's absolutely gorgeous. This is obviously a rose window. One of the things that we do with architectural designs like this is we look at it and then we look around. We see if it actually matches anything in the building. And most of the time it doesn't, which starts to raise questions. Why is this drawn here if it's not going to be mimicked in the actual architecture of the building? So it's thought that a lot of times this could be somebody going, oh, here's the design, like, is this what you would like? And then yes or no. If it's a no, you know, this would have been plastered over anyway and would have been hidden away from view, but the plaster has fallen off over time. And so now we can see it. Also, if you look at it, it's not 100% perfect. There's some mistakes in here. So a lot of times we're getting some of these drawings. It's probably a student learning from a master how to draw things, how to get the geometry right, how to get the shapes to line up. Because not only are these designs supposed to be beautiful and reflect the glory of God and all of that, they also have to be structurally sound. And if you're building something like a rose window or even the tracery window, the lancets that you get in the nave, they have to take quite a bit of weight. And so if you build it wrong, or you get the maths wrong, or you get the geometry wrong, it's going to collapse and that will be a problem. So that's sort of what we're seeing reflected here in these mistakes. Some of the other things you'll get if you're very, very lucky, and the good place to check for these is fonts. You will get leavings of architectural design lines, the actual laying out lines for something that would be in the church. So this is, again, St. Bartholomew the Great Smithfield. It's up in obviously one of the triforiums. And if you look, we have these lines, we have these arcs, we have these circles all overlapping. We have a beautiful center line there dividing the piece perfectly in half. These are crisp lines. And when we look at them, we look at what's around this particular piece of stone, we find this. This is the finished product. That is the laying out pattern for this particular design. You can see where the arcs, you can see where all those little arcs and those circles would have lined up and made that kind of beveled design in. And then on the side, you can actually see the very, very basic outline, the rectangle with the half circle underneath, also laying out that pattern for people to chisel away and create these beautiful kind of capitals with up in that space. So let's quickly do our two case studies before this talk comes to a close. So this is St. Vitus alias Foster in the City of London. This is in the Bell Ringers Tower. You may notice that all of the graffiti here is nice and black colored against this beautiful white plastering. That is because somebody went in with a Sharpie and helped. Again, please don't do this. What can happen if somebody does that is someone can go to scrub it out and end up damaging the stonework. The actual act of drawing can damage the stone and lose graffiti for us. Just please take photographs. It makes a great photo. It makes a great little image here, but just please don't do it. But you'll notice off the bat, we have a lot of initials. We have dates from the 1700s. We have peals of bells, which makes sense with where we are. This is the bell ringers chamber. This is what they do. Makes sense, logical sense. And then we start coming up, we look at the dates. We have a lot of stuff from the early to mid 1700s. Now, one summer during lockdown, I decided to dig through some parish records for this just to see what I could find. And I started putting in the names and the dates. I started kind of like look through deaths, and nothing matched deaths. Marriages, I believe Annabelle down here, the surname matched a marriage, but the first name didn't start with a B. And it was from far earlier than 1715. So it was like a sort of match, but not really. Then I came across this. The quote down here is, pardon that, it didn't format properly, but this is Benjamin James. And he wrote his name in this tower in 1723, 3 times. He was very excited about being able to do this. And the only thing I was able to find on him is that he was found in about 1711 or 12 as a foundling on Master Webb's store in the Old Change in March, and he was baptized on the 10th or 11th of March. And that's all we have about him. So whether he was found as a baby, as an infant, he would have been, you know, a preteen boy making these kind of inscriptions, or even if he had been a couple of years old, he still would have been a fairly adolescent or young man that would be making these, and it likely has something to do with him being allowed to ring the bells, him being able to add his name to the walls along everybody else, just from the context clues. That's what I'm pretty sure this is. But this is what I mean by initials and names don't necessarily mean a death. It can mean commemorating something else in the community or something that's important to that particular church or individual. In the case of Benjamin and James, likely being old enough to finally ring bells and take part in that community practice. Our last little tiny a little case study is going to be St. Margaret Stradazol, which is a church that I'm working on in my thesis over in Suffolk. We can see the bit of an old rood loft there. In terms of graffiti quantities, this one is one of my smaller ones, and it's got 142 images, but it also has a nice wall painting of St. Christopher, so we know that there is these kind of formal connections being made. It has bits of an old screen, so there's still old stuff there to give me some context clues to this graffiti. And when we look at the breakdown of graffiti, because when I do my stuff, I like to do it with numbers. 142 total. I haven't put every single thing on here because otherwise this table would be huge and not very interesting to look at. But we have 18, that's written words of phrases. That's that writing that we talked about in the beginning, could have a couple of different meanings. We have 11 sets of initials, 8 VV marks, which are widely considered to be apotropaic in certain contexts. And then we have 5 human figures, one of which is in pencil. For those who are only interested in the medieval and early modern, I always pull the pencil stuff out so that it's not necessarily included in the data set unless you want it to be included in the data set. And we have 18 circle-based designs and 1 animal. So what does this all mean? Like, why do we care? We should care because when we actually map it out and we look at it, we can start to see that the #1 hotspot for graffiti is right by this door, the doorway into the church from the porch. This would have been probably a meeting space for the laity. This would have been for people to gather and either write the names of certain things on the wall, show you what they wrote on the wall in a minute. This is also be a good spot for you to put any apotropaic things if you're concerned about things that ought not be getting in the building, getting in. And then the secondary hotspot that we get is in the chancel arch. And a lot of the stuff that we get in the chancel arch in this particular case is very neat writing, and it's very nicely done. It's readable. It's clearly done by people who are practiced at it. So that can be used as a bit of an indicator of literacy and also training with letters. And it would make sense because once we get up to the chancel, that's the area that is considered to be clergy only and off limits to the laity. So one thing that does need to be mentioned about this church and potentially why it has so few inscriptions, it's got a lot of plaster and paint on the walls, a lot. This is a VV mark. Because its lines are a little bit wider, it's isolated. I don't see anything else near it. I don't see any other letters that would kind of set it apart as maybe part of a name or something else. I'm going to go with this as probably a VV mark, not necessarily invoking the Virgin Mary. I think that at a certain point in time, these almost turn into good luck marks with just the way that we find them in their little clusters. But part of why we may not have a lot of graffiti here is because there's probably a lot more underneath this plaster that's a little bit fainter. And if this plaster ever comes off, if it ever falls off, this might need to be reinterpreted, and that's normal, but we may never have that chance. This plaster may just be there forever. It's hard to say. When we look at that pier by the door, which is where this is from, this is where we have our 1 animal in the church, and it is a bird. I know I said that birds are complicated, but this one to me looks very much like a peacock. Sat down with some people, had a look at it. It's got the 3 little things on its head and it's got a very long body, so it's potentially a peacock. It's right facing when you walk in, so it's clearly somebody trying to have some sort of status or claim some part of the building. Right above it, you can see the outline of a very crude little figure. We have some initials there and some very deliberate gouging and scoring of the stone. This is probably not to keep plaster sticking. This is probably somebody actually doing it, covering over something that might be lost. It's difficult to say because we've lost all of the paint and the plaster that this would have been carved into, and therefore we're missing part of our data set. We do, however, have a game board that is overlapped by some secular designs. Game boards are considered to be apotropaic when they're found in specific contexts. If they are vertical, if they're in a space where they can't be played. This one's too high to play while sitting and too low to play while standing. It's kind of at an uncomfortable shoulder height for the average person. The fact that it's right by this porch door where there's other kind of protective motifs going on and is actually in fact overlapped by circles, which are a protective motif, it's very likely that this has a protective function since it's kind of clustered in with everything else. And you have to read those context clues. Sometimes you get game boards on their own, and you'll find them on flat surfaces in cloisters or on choir benches or in window ledges, and they are big enough to be playable. And then at that point, you have to kind of go, yeah, people were literally just playing games. St. Nicholas Denstone has loads of game boards in its choir of all different sizes. So it's very clear that people were there getting bored in church and playing these little games throughout service. Now, when we look at the chancel and we look at the different kind of graffiti there, we have this rougher graffiti, this sloppier stuff in a way, because you saw those lines, they're a bit wider, a bit less skilled. And then we have these nice, neat lines spelling out names and amen, and a nice cross here in the chancel arch as you enter the holy space of the building. And this, with this building's distribution, this lends me to believe that the laity was very, very focused in the nave and their space, and the clergy was very, very focused in theirs, and the two kind of stayed apart for the most part. But as you actually enter the chancel arch and you look at the center point of it, you end up getting something that's a little bit messier. And this is kind of the big mystery of Shrouders Hall for me anyway. We have two faces looking at each other, a big one and a little one. And as we pull back, you look very carefully, this is with photogrammetry, and this leads me to my next point on conservation. You can start to see that there's a large arc here from an official like consecration cross, or from certainly at the very least Mason's dividers there in that space. And when you look down, there's this massive lines in the middle, and then you see a very distinct triangle shape that's filled with pock marks. So this is actually a full-figured, probably woman. She does have an arm outstretched, and there is a smaller figure to the left in a tunic, and they are facing each other and talking to each other. Now, this is very crude. It's not as neat as the stuff on the outside of the chancel arch. So its actual purpose and why and when it was made is a bit fuzzy to me, since everything else that we get that's crude is in the nave. That's one of the things that I'm hoping to explain in my thesis. So one of the ways that we can preserve graffiti like this is, of course, photogrammetry, which is what this is when we take a bunch of photos and we stitch them together and we can see bigger images. We can also preserve them in the event that there's damage to this church, or somebody accidentally scrapes part of this, or part of the stone falls out. A lot of things can happen in these old buildings. And now we have like a 3D model that we can work with later on. And then also from a conservation standpoint, if you are in churches and you are looking and you see stuff like this, we have this very damaged, decayed stone right up here. It looks like there's dust coming out. Please don't touch it, don't try to brush it away or anything like that. That is literal stone decay. Just basically kind of like maybe make a note of it. Like the church will know. Most of the time they do know. There's just other things that need to be fixed first, but photograph the graffiti from as many different angles as you can. You can do the photogrammetry and stitch it together and try and get something to preserve that piece. And then we have this other piece over here where you can see the W is really filled in. Don't ever try to chip any of that out. You can damage the original inscription. Again, just take a lot of photographs of it. For me, I prefer photogrammetry over RTI or laser scanning, because while those other two are really good, photogrammetry can be done quick on the fly and with a camera phone. And then if you have questions about it, you can feel free to send it to, like, I personally love getting email. I can't speak for the other graffiti people out there. I love getting email. Feel free to send it to me. You can put it on Twitter and ask people questions. There's Facebook groups out there. You can get kind of feedback on stuff. You can also send it to local heritage groups. Many churches now have local heritage groups, and they're recording graffiti, and that's how you can kind of get involved if you want to help record and conserve some of these. So I hope that this was full of new information, and if it wasn't, that it was at the very least interesting. And thank you all very much again for coming and listening, and thank you again to the Society of Church Archaeology for letting me speak tonight. So thank you.
Right, I've just finally unmuted myself and put myself back on the video. I want to say thank you so much, Crystal. That's a fabulous introduction to the very, very many different types that we've got. And I have this horrible feeling you're going to be absolutely swamped with different types of graffiti that we're all going to send you. I've got one a bit like the Lydgate rebus, so I'll definitely send you that. And I'm sure you're also going to be swamped with questions. Is that right, Rob?
Yeah, there are quite a few questions. So I'm going to have to filter some of them out. We might not get a chance to get to them all, but we'll do our best. Right. There is a first question here. It's going back to one of the effigies. And it says, is the study of this type of scratching and rubbing by hand the type of graffiti that would be included in an overall analysis of graffiti, or is this a separate topic? I mean, the differences are that it is done by hand and not a tool. The intent for making these scratches is different from the reasons that you covered in your talk.
I'm going to find that in the chat because that is a lengthy question.
Yeah.
And I want to make sure I answer it properly.
Yeah, it is. I think it was just due to the settings, it just came to me. But it's the study of that type of graffiti where on the effigies where there's a lot of rubbing and scratching of the graffiti by hand. Is that included in an overall analysis of the graffiti, or is it a separate topic?
Usually, so everybody doing graffiti right now kind of does it a little bit differently because everybody has really different interests in what graffiti means and what it could mean and its actual function. For me, I always include it. So right now I'm doing some work with Exeter Cathedral, and that monument I showed you is part of my data set. So I get to hand catalog everything on there that I can possibly see. And then I have another set of eyes usually look at it as well and help me make sure I didn't miss anything. But it will be included in the overall analysis of graffiti, because even though it's changing over time and it's changing meaning and function and form, it's still important to include in the data set. If there's ways that it can be broken out into different eras, the way I do things, I try to do my best with that so we can try to get a little bit of a graffiti chronology going, but that can be very, very difficult because the antiquated J, for example, that looks like a capital I with a line in the middle, that persists for well over 100 years. So it could be the beginning of that time period, at the ending of that time period, it gets very fuzzy. But generally speaking, when you are looking at graffiti and you are doing a full analysis of a building, stuff on those effigies should be included. Hopefully that answers it.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Another question here is, when did historic graffiti become sort of simpler? Historically, we read a deeper meaning into graffiti, but more recently, we appear to interpret it as a form of defacing.
So I think that starts to crop up around, it depends on where you're talking about, because when you look at the continent, there's stuff showing up as early as the 1500s and the 1600s telling people to not write on stone, to not engage with the stone, that there will be financial fines, and in one case, like public flogging, if you are caught writing into the stone in some of these chapels, particularly on the wall paintings. This is probably because those were very expensive wall paintings and they didn't want them covered with things. So that's where it seems to start over there. Over here, we really start to see this kind of revulsion to putting marks on things show up in the 1800s. That's when we start getting these public notices that if you go to some of these rooms, like if you go to Bury St. Edmunds, you can see this great sign and it's like, do not make, your own mark in these stones or something along those lines. We start seeing those plaques showing up. There's a couple of them on public buildings in London. That's when we start getting a more firm idea of like private ownership and like graffiti's damaging or it's hurting something. And I think that some of that is part of the movements that come in to research church histories and starting to consider these spaces as more of collections of artifacts than it is a living, breathing community space, if that makes sense. So I would say in England, we're looking at maybe very, very late 1700s in some areas of the country, I would guess. But certainly by the mid 1800s, there's certain areas where you can do graffiti. So for example, if you go to some of these churches, you'll find pencil graffiti all over the back of the organ case, but it's like, that's where the organ people do their organ people thing. And that's where they're allowed to do it. You don't really find as much of it in the main body of the church, unless it becomes this kind of weird touristy thing where people will be like, oh, I was here. And that doesn't seem to come too much into play. In churches, it comes more into play in things like ruined castles, like you get at Guildford.
Thank you. And another question is, I've had to rephrase this slightly, is there any quite explicit graffiti out there historically going back? And how do we interpret that?
If we're talking about rude graffiti,
I think we are. There were a couple of questions about that, so I had to slightly phrase it. I couldn't ignore the question.
No, it's fine. So I get this question all the time, and I have to say, it's a little bit annoying, because if you go back to Roman graffiti and Viking graffiti, you have so-and-so slept with so-and-so commenting on people's anatomy or things like that, showing up kind of all over the record. We get lots of, rude stuff. Then for some odd reason in the medieval period, it pretty much goes away. You'll occasionally get, like Ashwell has, like Barbara is a barbarian, shows up in there. That's a very loose translation of it. All these corners are, and even I spit on them. You get a little bit of snarky stuff showing up here and there, but you're not getting anything really explicit. You're not getting anything particularly sexual or rude showing up in these contexts pretty much. And then it seems to come back in graffiti in the 1900s. That's when we start getting women in various states of undress and more explicit commentary showing up, at least in England, from what I've seen anyway. But it's very, very weird. It basically, there's like this dead zone of rude things for a couple hundred years in England's graffiti archaeological record.
Yeah. Okay. The rest of the questions were mostly made up of people just wanting to check back on some of the references and the sources that you were explaining. So I think what would be best is if I can collect those from you, Crystal, in an email, and then afterwards I'll just knock an email out to everybody who's registered for this event, and then if you're interested,
absolutely,
that's up there. But just thank you for all your questions, and I'll just quickly hand back to Jackie before we finish.
Oh, brilliant. So I get the chance, first of all, to remind everyone who's a member of the Society for Church Archaeology to try and turn up for the online conference, which is Saturday week, and attend the AGM, which will be very short. And if you're not a member, please join. We have an excellent lecture series, thanks to Rob. And lastly, I think it's just time to thank Crystal again for a really excellent and thought-provoking talk. So thank you very much, and feel free to clap at home.
At home.